Hello, and welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to have two guests I'm talking to. I'm talking with Jomana Qaddour and Gissou Nia. Both of them work at the Atlantic Council. Jomana is a resident senior fellow, part of the Rafik Hariri Center and Middle East programs. She mostly works on some of the work in Syria, and she's currently a member of the UN-facilitated Syrian Constitutional Committee. She's also the co-founder of the Syrian Relief and Development Project. She's previously served as senior policy analyst at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and she's covered various countries such as Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Turkey. Gissou is also at the Atlantic Council. She's a director of the Strategic Litigation Project. She is a human rights lawyer and nonprofit leader, and she is also on the board chair of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. I wanted to talk to both of them because of their work. They obviously are doing fantastic work, but specifically on Syria. The Syrian conflict has been going on now for over a decade. There has been some U.S. involvement, but there's obviously been involvement from Iran, from Russia, and from many other places. And you know, as life moves on, and as there are many other conflicts that arise and many other global events, it sometimes can be forgotten that there is still a conflict going on in Syria, with some pretty atrocious things happening in Syria from the government and elsewhere. So I thought it was important to talk about a very serious issue and to try and talk about it with these two wonderful women that are on the front lines of this stuff, trying to really do good work and to make a lot of progress. We start the conversation by talking about some of the origins of the Syrian conflict and some of the basic statistical data. We talk about the chronological outline of the Syrian conflict up to the present. We talk about the impact of loyalties with other countries and regimes. We talk about the extent of the human rights violations in Syria. I think it's somewhere in the conversation that basically every worst possible thing that could be done to humans has been done to folks in Syria, which is just an atrocious thing to think about, and how it's been going on, all of displacement, all of the bombing of hospitals and hospital centers. We talk about the ineptitude of the international community and why they haven't done enough, previously and still now to prevent human rights violations in Syria. We talk about the international law components for human rights violations, and what are some of the pragmatic ways that people can get involved and try and do their part. This was, I think, a really important conversation. It's a conversation I'm proud of. Both Gissou and Jomana are quite lovely. They're brilliant, and just legitimately, brave women doing really good work to try and help folks in Syria and other countries. And so now I bring you Jomana Qaddour and Gissou Nia. I'm here with Jomana Qaddour and Gissou Nia. Thank you both for coming on the podcast and for being willing to talk to me about some of the work you're doing and some really important issues. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, of course. Okay, so why don't we first kind of just do introductions briefly, just tell folks who you are, what you do, what your work is in, and some of the main interest for both of you.
So I currently lead the Syria project at the Atlantic Council. And, we try to really highlight things for U.S. policymakers that are of relevance from Syrians on the ground, as well as, pressing, policy points on humanitarian aid, fighting ISIS, and other issues that are a priority for this administration, as well as work with Gissou Nia on accountability issues, which we'll get into a little bit later. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for having us on the podcast. I am a human rights lawyer, and I started out working on international criminal trials, so war crimes and crimes against humanity trials. I currently lead the strategic litigation project at the Atlantic Council, which focuses on trying to change existing laws that deal with redress for human rights violations and atrocity crimes, sort of strengthen the mechanisms that we have to support that kind of litigation. And we also engage in some impact litigation because of the survivors and victims of atrocity crimes and human rights violations that we're in contact with. And we focus on a bunch of different regions, but we have pretty built out programming on Iran, Syria, Uyghur issues in China. And we are starting to work a bit on the situation in Ukraine, as well as in Venezuela and Colombia. So those are some areas that we're looking at currently.
So what I'm hearing is that you guys not only doing wonderful work, you guys must be terribly busy all the time. I mean, there's enough stuff there to keep you guys occupied pretty frequently. So that's fabulous.
We probably should have mentioned that in addition to our Atlantic Council work, we each independently also work with other nonprofits that are working in this space. So I'm the co-founder of a humanitarian organization, and I only bring that up, Syria Relief and Development. I bring that up because a lot of the data that I'm going to mention, it has to do with a lot of hospitals and humanitarian work. And Gissou, I'll leave it to Gissou if she'd like to mention her other nonprofit work as well.
I'm board chair of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, and that NGO also engages in strategic litigation. So if it's looking at the Iranian state's role in Syria, for example, that would potentially be somewhere that we would be, working through, whether it's the organization submitting legal submissions or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, all of the work that you guys are doing, I think, is obviously super important, but it also has to have some element of risk as well, correct? I mean, you're dealing with certain countries and certain figureheads and states that are not favorable to getting critiqued about their human rights violations or how they're handling certain things. So there has to be some element of risk that's involved here now, or are you guys pretty insulated away from that? Well, how does that kind of factor out?
I don't think I can really answer that, to be honest. I think it might be better to not answer that.
Fair enough. That's a good answer.
Leave it there.
That's a good answer. Good answer.
Don't worry, Xavier. Nothing will happen to you.
No, I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about you guys. You guys are doing important work, so we need folks like you. Okay, so why don't we talk about Syria? There's a lot of, I feel like in many ways, I mean, unless folks that are in this space that are doing the work such as yourselves, Syria doesn't get talked about as much as it did maybe 5 years ago. Again, in certain spaces, I know it does, but kind of legacy media, kind of mainstream stuff, it doesn't get talked about as much. And so I want to just kind of talk about what's going on there still and some of the issues. So maybe just kind of give us, kind of drop us in terms of context of what's going on in Syria. So we can start with the Syrian conflict, kind of just when that started, and what's going on, what parties are involved, and why there is significant conflict there.
So I'll jump in here. As you probably know, Bashar al-Assad he is the current president of Syria. He's been in power since the year 2000, immediately following his father's death. Actually, the Syrian parliament amended immediately the constitution at the time, because at the time the constitution said the president had to be 40 years of age. So when his father passed away, they immediately amended the constitution to lower the age from 40 to 34 so that he could be permitted to take office immediately. A few days later, the Ba'ath Party, which is the current ruling party of Syria, unanimously elected Bashar as its leader. And they proposed him as the only candidate for the presidency. And he won with 99.7% of the vote. And thus began his first of now 3 7-year terms as president. It was renewed in 2017. You have 2014 was the next election, and then he was just elected again in 2021 in what can only be named as like sham elections without free and fair, proposal of candidates, as well as voting rights. So during, the early years of Bashar, there was a lot of speculation that maybe he would change the course of his father, that maybe he would allow for some room. Syria had been a pretty closed up economy. And a big part of that was because of their support for all kinds of terrorist groups during the invasion of Iraq. I mean, he would allow, people to go through Syria to attack American servicemen. And there had already been a series of, issues when as Bashar was taking his first years in office, and those sanctions were in place. There was a brief period, like in 2009, during the beginning of Obama's terms, where there was a possibility of some opening. We had some American officials meet with him in Damascus. He was, about doing more trade in Europe. There was like opening up of trade with Turkey, and the idea was, the thoughts were at the time that Bashar is going to be a modernizer, maybe he was forging a new path for the country. And unfortunately, the moment that was tested, we realized that was actually not the case. That's not what Bashar al-Assad was trying to do. He was trying to open up the country economically, but he was certainly not trying to open up or widen the aperture for, political rights, civil rights, et cetera, for average Syrians. And so, during the Arab Spring, a few months into the Arab Spring years, you saw, after Egypt and Libya, Yemen, you saw a group of young children, graffiti on walls in the southern province of Daraa, calling for the, basically that the people want the stepping down of the regime. Instead of handling that with maybe some genuine concessions of any type, what we saw instead was an immediate crackdown on civilians, on the children themselves, on their families. And so it was really understood that this is the way dissent was going to be handled. But given the wave of protests, the protests didn't cease immediately. What instead happened is that they spiraled out, right? And you saw a series of unarmed civilians take to the streets demanding their rights the way many of their other Arab neighbors had done. There was a brief period in November 2011 of that year where Bashar al-Assad appointed a constitutional committee supposedly to make some amendments to the constitution. What they did at the time was basically remove, in Article 8, it said that the Ba'ath Party could be the only party. They removed that specific language, but in practical terms, this has meant nothing because there is no other party that is actually genuinely allowed to exist, allowed to campaign in Syria. So it was more just sort of theatrics. And the people just, again, understood the direction of the uprising. And Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian Arab Army started attacking civilians from that summer. Unarmed civilians with weapons, picking up folks, scooping them up, throwing them into prison, many of whom were never to be seen again. So fast forward, now we have a conflict that has waged on since March 2011. You have, an upwards of 500,000 at least. The UN actually technically stopped counting. But they, back in, I believe it was 2014, but the date, I'd have to go back and double check that, but basically it's been many years now since the UN stopped counting the number of deaths. You have 13 million people displaced, at least 6 million of those as refugees in neighboring countries and in Europe, and a very small number here, unfortunately. You have 7 million displaced within Syria that have actually, of those 7 million, most of them have been displaced at least 6 times. So they've been moved from one province to another. And you have more than 200,000 people in Assad's prisons with no access to their families, no access, but, they have no idea what their fate is, if they're alive, if they're dead. COVID, of course, was a risk for prisons, but it's even beyond that. I mean, there was all kinds of torture that has taken place in this. There's been all kinds of documentaries made about this. The Caesar photos have tried to show the kind of torture that has taken place in these prisons. You have three, basically, just to give everyone the geography, you have three areas in Syria, one which is the Assad-held part of Syria, the government-controlled parts of Syria, where Russia and Iran have assisted the Syrian regime in maintaining control over those areas. And you have two other areas. You have the northwest Syria, where you have some room for civil society and humanitarian organizations like mine to function. You also have about 10,000 Turkish troops protecting that area from Russian invasion, based on an agreement that was struck between the Russians and the Turks in March 2020. And finally, you have northeast Syria, where you have the SDF, so the Syrian Democratic Forces, that are largely Kurdish forces, along with about 900 US troops. And then you have about 3 million civilians in northwest Syria, and then another 3 million Syrians in northeast Syria. So I'll stop there because I want to give us an opportunity to kind of delve in as needed.
Yeah, sure. Is there anything that you would like to jump in here with, Gissou?
No, Jomana is really best placed to give sort of the overview of the conflict in Syria and what's happening there. I think I'm happy to jump in to explain some of the accountability mechanisms that are moving forward. So later when we get into that, I'm happy to dive into that part.
Sure. I guess about Syria. So I guess the one question I have is that this seems to be a kind of a spinning out from the Arab Spring. So for the first, let's say, call it decade, 11 years that Assad was in power, was there any type of resistance, or this was just complete, he's the person, he's the one that's running it? I mean, what was the kind of pulse or temperature, kind of average nationally, of how people felt about him, how he was doing things economically or foreign affairs wise, or with other certain groups, or what have you? I mean, it sounds like the Arab Spring really kind of set things off, but I guess there was 11 years before that. Was this like premeditated where he wanted to do some of this potentially, or was this really just a kind of reactionary thing, kind of just right up to that? How was it?
So, I mean, during his father's time, so his father led Syria during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. There had been one major crackdown in Syria, which was called the Hama massacre. I think in which, 40 and upwards of 40,000 people were completely killed after an entire city was razed down by his father, when there was the possibility of when sort of the rumblings of of a uprising were taking place. So the Syrian people had remembered this, right? And it had taken them a lot, I think, to get to where they got in 2011. Now, the Arab Spring, I think, gave many of them hope, and sort of injected that, that sort of a gust of energy of, maybe there is another way that Syria can be. And we're seeing this happen in other countries. Egypt is considered sort of the role model for the entire Arab world. And people saw what was happening in Egypt and were like, well, if this can happen in Egypt, maybe it can happen here. But I'll say this, initially when people took to the streets to protest Bashar al-Assad, outside of the situation with the kids in Daraa, you had many people in the streets that were just asking for reforms initially. They were asking for a modification of the law. Like they didn't immediately go to asking for his removal. But it became clear very quickly that there would be no space for people's demands. I mean, you saw other countries in the region look at this moment and be like, okay, we're going to prevent a massive uprising by giving the people giving them some overtures of, making some concessions. But unfortunately, the Assad regime refused to make any concessions from the outset. There had been during those 11 years attempts, most prominently the Damascus Declaration, which happened in 2005, when there were a group of, we'll call them opposition leaders, but not necessarily opposition in the way we see today. I mean, they were much more mild in their approach of setting up a press conference, making a declaration about asking for some, for modifications. And almost all of them were arrested by the Assad regime at the time. So there had been, even more moderate steps towards those modifications, sort of modification of the regime, were dealt really with a heavy hand by the Assad regime. And so that's why, even though they initially started asking for reforms, many were deeply skeptical. When you ask what people think of the Assad regime, I'm not going to tell you that every single person hates Assad. I mean, you're talking about a country of upwards of 20 million people. Obviously, people have different opinions on him, on the regime, on what provides them security and stability. Many of them stay quiet. I would say the overwhelming majority probably stays quiet in regime-held areas because they're not interested in being arrested or displaced or, being deprived of basic things. And you can't blame many of them for doing that. But you do have a good number of them, I would say 6 to 7 million in North Syria, that remain there because they do not want to live under the heavy hand of Bashar al-Assad. And I think increasingly what we see today is that, there might have been more of a semblance of a state in the early 2000s. It was still really a one-party system. But, there might have been a little bit more sort of, like I said, the semblance of a state. And now you ask people, and it's basically become, a mafia-like system in its survival to remain in place, in how it's dealt with, really just, the distribution of any goods in the country, who has access to jobs. We're talking about a country where 90% of the people are under the poverty line. And the few resources that are available, I can assure you, the regime is not prioritizing the average Syrian citizen. It is prioritizing its networks and what's, the people it needs to keep in its good favor to remain in place and to remain, ruling over Syria. But it's far from a stable situation.
So I guess kind of fast forwarding to more of the present. So it kind of, you describe how it started out and then where are we at? How did it escalate? What were certain key moments, I guess, in the past now, 11 years now that it's been going on? Where is the conflict with which groups and why are other countries becoming involved here? I mean, obviously there's political alliances, X, Y, and Z, but I mean, why you mentioned Russia. I think you mentioned Iran as well is involved here. Why that involvement there as well?
Well, I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on because what I really want to dive into is sort of where we are in Syria today. But briefly, listen, the Syrian conflict has had all kinds of international actors involved from the beginning. I mean, there were different Gulf countries that were involved. You have Qatar, you have individuals, parliamentarians in Kuwait. So there were some people involved both either at an individual level or state level. The Emiratis were involved at one point. The Saudi. I mean, so you had different Gulf involvement. You had Turkey because Turkey is literally on the border of Syria, and has a direct. There was obviously national security concerns from the outside, given it shares a border. Jordan also shares a border. Iraq also shares a border. Lebanon shares a border. And so there were all these different countries that were involved in the region. In addition to that, the United States obviously is one of the most, influential countries in this region. Syrians were asking for the United. I mean, there were. I'm not going to say all Syrians, but there was a good number of Syrians who were being bombarded that were seeking assistance from the United States and Europe, saying, to put this, to put the violence to an end. Now, with regard to Russia and Iran, and you have, and this might be something that Gissou also wants to chime in on. Iran, through its proxies and its militias, was involved, from nearly the outset. The Syrian government already had relationships with Iran and Russia that predated the 2011 conflict. A lot of the Syrian military, they do all kinds of exchanges with the Russian military. That relationship's been there since the 60s, 70s. With Iran, I would say Hafez al-Assad built that relationship during his tenure. And when Bashar came to power, so that was already kind of in place. But Hezbollah, as the main militia in Lebanon, was directly intervening on behalf of the regime and for its own interests, sort of on behalf of Iran and its own interests, which happened to coincide also with the Syrian regime interests, in order to try to use violence to put down the rebellions. And the perfect example of this was Homs. Which was the city I was actually born in, which is very close to the Lebanese border. And Hezbollah put an end or tried to put an end to the protest there from very early on, because it wanted to secure not only the Assad regime, but also the land bridge that it has with getting weapons to Hezbollah, out of Iraq via Syria. And so this was something that was very important to them. And so Iran, through its proxies, was involved, and I'll let Gissou add if she'd like to add to that. Russia was asked formally to intervene with its military in 2015, but and many say by the Iranians, they were asked to do that in order to secure Aleppo, and have been inside of Syria ever since. Gissou, if you'd like to add anything specifically on the Iran part.
Yeah, on the Iran part, there's a few things. One is that Bashar al-Assad's father was the first Arab leader, if I'm not mistaken, to formally recognize the Islamic Republic of Iran. Mm-hmm. So when Iran had a revolution in 1979, deposed the monarchy, and the initial founder and supreme leader, Khomeini, who sort of took over, there was a vote on whether or not to establish this Islamic Republic. When it was established, a very contested vote. We won't get into that here, but basically, Bashar al-Assad's father was the first Arab ruler to recognize the Islamic Republic. So these ties go way back. A lot of people, including in Iran, have been convinced that the reason that the Iranian state is involved in Syria is only to fight Daesh, ISIS. So there really is this view, which is not accurate, but the view is simply that Qasem Soleimani, the general who was, killed by the US and so on, that they're really there to simply combat ISIS. The reality is that the Iranian state has been involved in the country since 2011. As Jomana pointed out, they were actually some of the IRGC, so the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, they were very involved in training up and helping to support some of the Syrian regime forces that were running detention centers, essentially. So they provided critical assistance in how to do the worst of the worst, frankly, how to repress the population who was protesting for their rights, how to essentially ensure that detainees would then be silenced. And this is all out of a playbook that the Iranian state has used many times in repressing its own protests at home. So prior to 2011, there was a very violent crackdown in Iran against post-election protests. They were nonviolent protests. They were contesting a vote. This was in June 2009 and in the months after. And so a lot of that know-how was essentially transferred over to Syria. And when I'm looking at a list of alleged Iranian state perpetrators who are responsible for acts in Syria, some of them have been killed, but some of them are still alive. Many of them had hands in repressing student protests in Iran in 1999, repressing the post-election protests in 2009. So these are people who are very trained in how to repress popular uprising, essentially, even when it's peaceful. So I won't get too into the weeds here, but the relationship is strong, has lasted for a long time, since the very inception of the Islamic Republic in 1979 and the years after. And I think for the Iranian state, it was just a non-negotiable to have Assad not in power, because of the fact that they'd like to have, I think Jomana alluded to this, but they would essentially like to have access to Lebanon, and this sort of ensures that, they're in some ways controlling parts of Iraq at the moment. And so this essentially assures that they have this contiguous land access, and it's part of the regional plan. I think the issue, aside from the geopolitics and who controls who, is that from my perspective, it's not so much about who's controlling territory, it's about what they're doing to civilians along the way. I'm less concerned with the geopolitics than I am with what it means to be able to secure this access, how it means that, there's indiscriminate killing of civilians to secure that, and essentially a lot of war crimes and crimes against humanity. But we can get into that later.
Yeah. So that was actually my next question is, what are, maybe just give us the kind of landscape that's there in terms of human rights violations within Syria, whether it's been, whether the person that is, or the group that's committing it is the Syrian government or other entities. What's the kind of overview or landscape of the major human rights violations that we know or see in Syria?
So I'll start off by talking about some of it, and I think Gissou knows a lot more about the torture and a lot of the stuff with the prisons, and I'd like her to talk a lot about more about that. But just having been part of the humanitarian operations on the ground, or having staff that were on the ground doing this the entire time, I think it's really important to highlight, because the harassment, the violence, the attacks that they were subject to were solely because they were addressing the sort of the humanitarian response. So I'm not even talking necessarily here about political opposition members, right? These are people who are doctors, who are personally targeted, nurses, humanitarian workers. And so it was really, as Gissou alluded to this, it was really an attack on civilians. I mean, this was a war not waged just on armed militants, between the Assad regime and his allies with just armed militants. The strategy here was to starve and attack civilians for political aims, which is why you continue to see, critique of, for example, like when the Assad regime is given aid from the United Nations, how that aid is distributed. Because while many of us in the West think, it shouldn't matter what your political beliefs are. If you are a human being in need of humanitarian aid, you should deserve it. You should have access to it. That is absolutely not the mentality that we're dealing with on the other side, right? Where food, medical care, access to a hospital are basically given only if you can, give loyalty and salute Assad and sort of his fellow allies. So just real quick, something that I think has been in the news a lot is attacks on hospitals. We're seeing this now in Ukraine. Russia is following the exact same playbook that it did in Syria. We had 601 attacks on hospitals just from September 2015, when Russia became involved and used its air power. From 2015 until now, there have been 601 healthcare facilities that were attacked. We've seen attacks. This includes attacks on women's facilities, on people who on cancer wards, maternity wards. We've seen the attack on humanitarian convoys. We've seen this actually throughout the conflict, where even UN humanitarian convoys were attacked by the Syrian government. We've seen that happen. We've seen 1 in 3 Syrian schools destroyed or damaged, for a total of 700 education facilities that were hit. We saw humanitarian convoys not only attacked, as I mentioned, but also completely blocked from going into the areas. Or when a humanitarian convoy is allowed to enter, it's actually emptied of any substantive medical aid. So a lot of times the Syrian regime would say, look, we sent in this humanitarian aid convoy to these besieged areas. They would send it in with like gauze, basically, or like, pretty empty boxes. They would never actually deliver any significant humanitarian aid to the people inside of Syria. Siege warfare was something that they absolutely employed in several cities in Syria. Most notably, we saw in Aleppo, where 300,000 people were held under siege for several months, for about a year, in order to make sure that city, which is the largest city in Syria, fell eventually to Assad and his allies. We saw, and during that time, by the way, during that year of the siege, the city was hit 250 times a day. At least 250 bombs would fall on civilians per day. We also had in Ghouta, which was a siege that lasts, it's a suburb of Damascus, a siege that lasted 7 weeks, trapped 393,000 people. And even when they were allowed to leave, a lot of times those humanitarian corridors were actually routed to government-held areas, unbeknownst to the civilians that were making their way out. And so they were basically being led into territory where they would be arrested, harassed, or never seen from again. And then most recently, we saw the massive bombardment of Idlib, which is, as I mentioned before, the northwest part of Syria, where you have 3 million Syrians that were stuck there, completely under siege. 1.4 million of them were eventually displaced. Remember, I said in the beginning, some of these people have been displaced 6 times. Mm-hmm. So they were displaced from one part of Idlib further north into Idlib. And this is an area that is a very tiny area. I mean, this is an area where there's not enough shelter. There's not enough funding for shelter. A lot of these people, if they even have tents, live in tents that flood every single year. And so this is absolutely an unsustainable situation for those civilians over there. We've also seen what Russia has expertly done is use the United Nations for its own political aim as a UN Security Council member. And this has become one of the most controversial things. And this is something that Syrians have now warned Ukrainians about. So to give you a good example of this, there were two issues here. So because hospitals were being systematically targeted by the Russians and the Syrian government, this thing called the Deconfliction Mechanism was created. So basically the UN said, okay, everyone with a hospital, give us your coordinates and we will give it to the parties to the conflict so that they know where these hospitals are. And that way they can avoid hitting the hospitals. Now, I'll tell you, when talking to our staff, they were deeply skeptical and really not wanting to give their GPS coordinates they're like, we don't trust the Russians, they're targeting us. And in fact, what they said eventually came true, because what happened is Russia continued to attack those hospitals. And in fact, now they have the GPS coordinates of where all those hospitals were. And so they used that mechanism in order to be able to better target these hospitals. And it got to a point where civilians in Syria did not even want to live anywhere near a hospital. So in desperate areas outside of the government-held areas, they said, please, when we would talk to communities, we would have to negotiate the placement of a hospital, because they said every time you put a hospital, the Russians come and bomb it. And even when we did fortified hospitals under the ground, the Russians had the capability to further target hospitals that were under the ground. And there's some really great documentaries that talk about this. And so this was one thing. And then we also saw that now with the UN Security Council mechanism, where Russia every year, it's been year after year now, threatens to veto life-saving UN aid from going into Syria and areas outside of the government. And so every year it basically tries to hold hostage the international community into giving it what it wants in terms of trying to, reduce sanctions or to make any other political compromises for Syria in order to allow the United Nations to continue delivering life-saving aid in areas outside of the government. And so these are ways that Russia has utilized the UN Security Council mechanism, and it's something not just to be studied but to be really reviewed. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll turn it over to Gissou, is most notably, we are seeing a lot of the same actors, specifically on the Russian side that fought in Syria, now make their way over and commit the same, war crimes and crimes in the Ukrainian context. So there's a man that's now being, his name is being circulated. He's called the butcher of Syria. He was known, Alexander Vornikov, who, flew, they say, launched more than 9,000 combat flights in Syria, raiding cities like Aleppo. And he has a history of working with the Wagner Group, which is a, private Russian militia that, has committed all kinds of crimes. And he was actually given an award by the Russians as the Hero of Russia Award for his acts in Syria. So we've seen many like him. I think it's important to understand what role this played, what the Russians learned in Syria and what they're now using, the same tactics they're using in Ukraine. So I'll turn it over to you, Gissou.
Jomana really gave, I think, quite the comprehensive coverage of, the scope of what's happened and sort of, anecdotal bits about what has happened. But just in sum, essentially, what a lot of folks say when they survey this, whether it's investigators or lawyers who've been working on these files, is that there really is no core human right that hasn't been violated in this conflict. And there is almost no atrocity that is codified that has not been committed by either the Syrian regime or their allies or other parties to the conflict, and also ISIS and some of the jihadist groups that also have been held to account for different atrocities. But it's really just mind-blowing how the entire spectrum of crimes has been committed in the Syrian conflict. And Jomana went into the details, but that includes summary executions, torture, forcible disappearances of tens of thousands of people, chemicals, weapons use. If we're looking at, the broader crimes that ISIS was committing in some of these territories, genocide against the Yazidis. Jomana already mentioned the deliberate targeting of hospitals and health workers, but really it's quite expansive, and so there really is no lack of violation to pursue justice for, and there really is not a lack of documentation either. I should say a lot of these crimes have been exhaustively documented in one way or the other. And so this does set it apart from maybe other conflicts in which some of that evidence can be really hard to come by to be able to prove, who's responsible and how. I'll note that one thing that's really concerning, and I think that's driven a lot of maybe some of the narrative in some corners, of the world around how, bombing civilians, essentially this has all been done under the guise of sort of combating terrorism. So I think it's become incredibly problematic because there are thousands of civilians who've been harmed. It's absolutely a disproportionate use of force, and it's not really meeting these aims, but it's kind of under this cover of, this sort of pretext of going after terrorists. And we sort of see that same narrative now playing out in Ukraine. Obviously, lots of civilians are being killed, but, there's a sort of narrative, a false narrative around denazification. It's a very similar types of narratives that the Russian state deals in, that the Syrian regime dealt in, and that, the Iranian state was supporting all along the way. But yeah, so that's, there's a full gamut of crimes, essentially.
I want to ask about, I think the way both of you guys described it was very comprehensive. I guess my question is maybe both of you have asked this the same thing. What is it going to take for the international community to have more involvement to prevent this from happening? I'm sure there have been some things that have been tried, but I mean, we have the UN Security Council, we have places like the ICC. I mean, what is the international community doing, either with allies in the region? Obviously, there was the big Obama's red line when if there was use of, I think it was sarin gas, right, as chemical weapons, and he went back on that for a whole host of reasons. I mean, why I guess is there not more being done? If you're saying there's so much documentation of basically every atrocity to human beings, what's the holdup? Why is there not more being done?
I'll just jump in on one thing, and then I think that might set up the conversation, which is that there's the discussion about prevention. So, I think, unfortunately, the international community missed the mark on prevention, clearly, because we find ourselves in the position, as Jomana noted, where the UN stopped counting deaths after 500,000, and that's unacceptable. Yeah. And I think in many ways, Syria was the conflict that sort of proved the complete and utter futility of any political political part of the United Nations. The United Nations does a lot of good in terms of its World Food Program, UNHCR, UNICEF, all its agencies, sure, and especially on the humanitarian side. But when it comes to the political bodies and how they make decisions, I think Syria is very much seen as like the utmost failure. I think we're seeing a different kind of movement in response to what's unfolding in Ukraine, which makes me feel a bit more positive. I don't want to get too much into the details there, but I'm sure Jomana has some things to add on that. But there's a prevention side, and then there's taking account of what's happened now for purposes of accountability for war crimes, crimes against humanity, but also looking at resolving issues for persons who, for example, have members of their family and their loved ones who've been forcibly disappeared. They still don't have answers. They haven't been reunited with their family members or the remains, as horrific as that is. And so there's some ongoing pieces to this, how I think some of the big prevention efforts should have unfortunately failed. And we're now in a different place. I think Jomana can speak more to that. But with the accountability piece, I'm happy to dive in on like what still can be done and what should be done and why it should be done and kind of what the existing framework is, and also what the limitations have been. But Jomana, I don't know if you want to like jump in on that prevention piece.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about that, but for the sake of time in your audience, what I really want to do is talk about like what we can do, right, moving forward. So the accountability stuff Gissou has to say is really important. But there have been a series of political conferences that aimed from the beginning to try to, narrow the gap between the Syrian government and the variations of the opposition. There's numerous different factions within the opposition based in different capitals. There's some that are based in Istanbul, some based in Moscow, some based in Cairo. But to try to really, the whole aim was to get Bashar al-Assad to agree to, initially to step down, but if not that, then at least to share power with the opposition. That was what you have 2254. Okay, sorry, for a second I forgot. UN Security Council Resolution 2254 that really laid the outline for how to move forward, and all the Security Council resolution had agreement from Russia, from the United States, from other members of the Security Council, obviously, in order to move Syria politically. So it articulated things like the transitional governing body, the fight against terrorism, unfettered access to humanitarian aid. It articulated all these things, free and fair elections, and none of these things that have actually come to fruition. It's a very tricky situation because it's the only document that the opposition, the regime, through Russia and including the United States and others all agreed to. But we have seen so many actions from specifically the Syrian regime side that continue to thwart any effort to implement any of this realistically. The most recent iteration of sort of political talks is the UN Constitutional Committee, of which I'm actually a part of. I'm a member of on the civil society group. And the whole aim here was for the first time in 11 years to bring members of the regime with members of the opposition, with members of civil society to try to draft a new constitution. And even though as someone who studies, as a comparative constitutional law scholar, although I do think that there are many issues with the Syrian constitution, including the fact that the president can just dissolve parliament at his will. Syria's primary issue is not really the constitution, but rather constitutionalism, right? The actual implementation, the actual the rule of law, actually implementing anything that is drafted. And without that will and guarantors who can say, yes, this new constitution that is drafted will actually be implemented, then your time is actually wasted. It's not actually solving the issue. And so that's currently where we are because, while, the West, led by the United States, but also hand in hand with Europe and other actors have tried to put all kinds of proposals on the table. And I can honestly say that there has been nothing that the Syrian government or Russia or its Iranian ally have actually said, we are willing to take this step. We are willing to move forward in this way, for example, to make sure that refugees can return home, promising them that they won't be harassed, promising that they would have access to their properties. This stuff is not guaranteed. This is a big reason why refugees don't go home. We've said, here's UN aid. Can you make sure that it's distributed based on who needs it, not on who's loyal to you? Again, there have been so many reports written about, the misdirection of UN aid by the regime and its allies. And so I can go in, I can name a million different files where we have seen the regime and its allies continue to thwart any movement towards progress or genuine political resolution of the Syrian uprising.
Yeah, that's really helpful to understand. I guess two questions here. So, Gissou, I wanted to get you in here on accountability and responsibility, as you mentioned. You can talk about that, and then I guess what can be done now for certain groups or for certain individuals. Like, what can pragmatically, kind of be done to try to work towards solutions. So maybe kind of take both those.
So I think the justice piece is really important because in addition to ensuring that, victims that have a right to remedies under international law, but who really, or rather a right to reparations under international law, but really have no form of remedies to seek, like we need to ensure that happens because just for the point of making victims and survivors somewhat whole, but also because there is ultimately a sort of deterrent effect. And I think if we also look at the list of alleged perpetrators, we see that had, for example, there not been a taboo around going after Russian state actors' responsibility in the Syria conflict, then we wouldn't necessarily have seen similar actions taken in Ukraine. I think, for example, the strikes on healthcare facilities that Jomana brought up, that is a relatively, for centuries, really, there's been, or more than a century, there's really been an understanding that armed forces should not be bombing hospitals. That's sort of seen as like a red line. It compounds humanitarian catastrophe. It goes way beyond just an attack on civilians because it's actually preventing the provision of medical care to anybody that is armed and that is harmed in conflict. And we really saw that taboo kind of go out the door in the Syria conflict, as Jomana noted with the numbers. And the Russian state was responsible for so much of that. And they are repeating that playbook in Ukraine. And so because the international community didn't forcibly come down on really enforcing the norm of not attacking healthcare, we find ourselves in this situation. So not only is redress critical for Syrian victims and survivors, it's actually critical for the globe because what it means about a sort of culture of impunity that's incredibly corrosive and gives the green light to dictators to kill civilians indiscriminately with no consequences. So justice is not only a sort of backward-looking thing, it's very much a forward-looking thing. And so the main reason, I think, Xavier, you were asking before, why is there this blockage on accountability, despite all this documentation, despite the fact that crimes A to Z have been committed in Syria? And the answer is really that because of the conflict in Syria starting out, it's no longer that, but because of it starting out as a sort of, civil conflict or an interstate conflict, or essentially Assad against, his own people, so to speak, it kind of got, it got into a situation where, jurisdictional issues complicated it, where there wasn't necessarily a ready forum to be able to prosecute these crimes. So, for example, typically crimes are any type of violent crime around the world is usually adjudicated in a court where the crime, has some sort of territorial or nationality link, right? So if there's a killing that somebody commits in a state in a city in Mexico, presumably a court around where that killing occurred around where the victim was from and around where the alleged perpetrator was from would be the court that would hear that. But what we have in a situation like Syria is that clearly, because the state is the perpetrator, we wouldn't have a situation in which any of this could be tried in domestic courts. The judiciary is not independent. We're not going to have a scenario in which torturers in Assad's detention centers are going to be held to account in Syria's domestic criminal trials. That's just not a realistic proposition. Mm-hmm. And that often tends to be the case in a lot of dictatorships around the world that are committing really bad acts against their own people and repressing their own people. There's not really a ready forum for that. So that's step one. There's no prospect for meaningful, fair domestic trials. Step two is that that's usually when the international system would step in. So we have a system of international courts that have been established to essentially deal with the issue of when a state is unwilling or unable to prosecute these crimes. So that's why we have what is now a permanent international criminal court, the International Criminal Court that's based in The Hague. And it's really a court of complementarity. The idea being that it steps in to prosecute, and try crimes when a state is unwilling or unable to do so. So what everyone would hope is that the situation in Syria would have been referred to the International Criminal Court. Now, Syria is not a member of the International Criminal Court. It never signed and ratified the Rome Statute, which gives rise to the court. But, there's a lot of other states that aren't members of the court, and the situation that happens within their territory actually is referred to the court. So, for example, with Libya or Sudan, the UN, they were not members of the International Criminal Court, but the UN Security Council referred the matter to the International Criminal Court. So you might guess what the issue is with a UN Security Council referral of the war crimes and crimes against humanity in Syria to the ICC. It's that Russia is on the UN Security Council. So clearly, given the role that they played in the conflict, we can't very well assume that they would then be happy to sort of refer the matter to the ICC. Now, this is distinct from what's happening, for example, with Ukraine now, where Ukraine is the subject of an investigation at the International Criminal Court. Ukraine was also not a member of the ICC, but critically, the Ukrainian state actually made a declaration of jurisdiction. So they can voluntarily accept the jurisdiction of the court, and they did so. So that's why, despite Russia being on the UN Security Council, despite Russia not being a member of the ICC and Russian perpetrators being investigated as part of, the investigations on the situation of Ukraine, we can still move that forward. Obviously, that wasn't going to be an option with Syria, because again, we have the situation where a dictator is repressing his own people. With Ukraine, we have an outside invader that's coming, to commit crimes and all that. So it's set up a bit different jurisdictionally. So that's why the matter never went to the International Criminal Court. Now, I should note there's been some creative jurisdictional attempts, creative attempts at jurisdiction to try to get transboundary crimes that have happened in the Syrian conflict but have been completed in the state of Jordan, the neighboring state of Jordan, which is a member of the ICC. There's been some attempts to try to get what is called a pretrial examination opened up by the ICC prosecutor. In full disclosure, I was counsel on one of the submissions that have been made to the ICC prosecutor about specifically about the Iranian state's role in forcibly deporting and displacing Syrian civilians into the territory of Jordan, persecuting them and committing other inhumane acts. But before, I made that submission, there were other submissions made by other chambers who really focused on the actions of the Assad regime in expelling Syrian civilians over into Jordan. So those requests are pending. And I think what's really critical to look at here is now that this sort of taboo or red line about looking at Russian state involvement has essentially been broken when it comes to now they're definitely being investigated in the situation of Ukraine. I think it's going to be critical to kind of look at the overlap between the Russian units, the units of the Russian armed forces that were bombing Aleppo and other cities in Syria that led to, civilians needing to flee into the territory of Jordan, looking at that and looking at the same actors that might be responsible for bombing Mariupol in Ukraine, for example, and really linking up those investigations and, essentially starting the pretrial examination on these transboundary crimes that were committed in the Syrian conflict at the ICC, because there's going to be a lot of evidence that might be able to be shared across these files. So I think there might be some new energy into looking at hopefully, getting a pretrial examination opened along these lines. I think the prosecutor's office would have a lot to work on. So that's ICC. The last thing I'll say is that where the promise really has moved forward in terms of justice, not in any large degree, but at least provided some hope, is really with prosecutions happening in national courts under principles of universal jurisdiction. So what that means is there's some, in very lay people terms, is there are some crimes that are so heinous that the decision from states has been that they have a responsibility to prosecute them in any court around the world, regardless of where they occurred and regardless of the nationality of the perpetrators and the victims. So what we see in Germany, for example, are trials involving, war crimes and crimes against humanity that happen in Syria that involve Syrian victims, Syrian perpetrators, and that happen in the territory of Syria, but those criminal trials are being held in Germany. We also see that in Sweden, France, a raft of other countries as well. But this is all under universal jurisdiction principles. And so that, I think, has been among the more promising developments in terms of justice. But there's a long way to go, because in some of these countries, there are no statute of limitations for some of these crimes, which enable, or the statute of limitations is 2002, which is well before, these atrocities began. But there are other procedural hurdles in some jurisdictions. There are issues around victims being willing to participate in proceedings because they're concerned about their families back in Syria and their protection. There are also limitations around being able to ensure that alleged perpetrators, particularly those that were in the Assad regime, can be held to account. So we see a lot of trials of, I wouldn't say a lot, but a fair number of trials of, alleged jihadists who were part of, al-Nusra Front or other groups, because often having those individuals, especially if they have a dual nationality, so if they have a European nationality as well, and they went over to Syria to fight, or they were essentially went there, but they have another nationality. It's easier to bring those prosecutions sometimes because it's easier to have jurisdiction over those alleged perpetrators and ensure that they show up for trial. So without having trials in absentia, which some jurisdictions have, others don't. That's maybe one of the bigger hurdles, and that'll be that up until now, that was going to be a hurdle with prosecuting any members of the Russian armed forces or, the political and civilian leadership that sort of the political and military leadership that sort of ushered this in. But I think we're going to see that taboo sort of, erased a bit with the Ukraine situation. And we're going to need to focus on how to make sure that some of that energy in holding Russian perpetrators accountable, for instance, is applied to the situation in Syria.
That's absolutely helpful what you're describing. I want to respect both your guys' time, as I know you're both very, very busy. So just kind of the last point, either one of you can take it, or Jomana, if you want to take it. What in the work that you guys do at the Atlantic Council or other organizations, what can we do now? What can be done? Whether it's at a group level or individual level or what have you, just kind of what are some of the pragmatic ways of trying to handle or deal with resolving some of these challenges?
So, I mean, if I'm assuming not all of your audience works in policy, right? So not everyone can go in and tell the U.S. administration how to work on these things. But I think one of the most important things is really for people to be educated on what actually happened. And I say that because I think, misinformation, disinformation are some of we keep hearing these words flying around. And it's the way that a lot of these conflicts are presented, are phrased, are on various media outlets can be really problematic. The Russians, the Iranians have absolutely made an effort. That's nothing to say, obviously, with the Assad regimes, they have one state media channel. I mean, people do not have access to free and fair, unfettered access to information. But, the Russians and the Iranians are actually really good at sort of twisting the narrative so that you end up blaming victims in many cases. And so I think one of the most important things is there are so many different books written by Syrians themselves or, journalists or others who lived in Syria and were there and could sort of really present what really happened on the ground. There are several documentaries. We are actually hosting one tomorrow at the French Embassy called Bringing Assad to Justice. That's one of, only the newest of a series of documentaries. There's For Sama. There are documentaries about the White Helmets, but really understanding what happened in Syria. There are numerous charities also that have been doing a lot of good work, both in terms of collecting evidence, and also continuing to provide life-saving work. And then finally, I would say, pushing our governments, our members of Congress, and other people with authority to at least, to support a lot of these accountability mechanisms, right? Members of Congress if no one in their constituency cares about Syria, I assure you they're not going to put in too much effort in trying to address that. But if you make it known that you do want, for the sake of a lot of these international institutions that we invested in, that we created, the sort of accountability for the betterment of, for preventing what's happening in Ukraine from happening in other countries, right, in that region. I think it's really important that we take accountability seriously. And so flagging that constantly for people in leadership positions and policymaking policymaking posts, I think is vital. That would be my recommendation.
That's wonderful. I want to know. I thank both of you guys for coming on and sharing all this. There's obviously so much information. There's so many moving parts and all this stuff. So it's a lot of stuff. And I'm very, very grateful for you guys explaining everything so well and sharing the work you guys do and what can be done. Where are the best places for people to find either your work, the stuff that you guys are doing, the organizations you're involved in, any particular places that you would want to direct people that can be helpful?
Go ahead.
People can just follow me on Twitter. I'm at Gissou Nia, so GISSOUNIA. I post everything there.
Okay.
Same. You could follow me at Jomana Qaddour, so JOMANA QADDOUR. And we obviously produce a lot of different kinds of publications at the Atlantic Council related to Syria, related to our accountability work. And that's all posted on the website of the Atlantic Council Middle East programs and the Strategic Litigation Program. So please, look at the content there.
Yeah. That's absolutely wonderful. Big thanks to both of you guys. I really, really appreciate it. You're doing incredible work, really, really important work. And you guys are a big inspiration to me and doing such really, really nice things to try and resolve some of the really hard challenges. So thank you for all you're doing. Keep doing it. And I really thank you for taking the time to come and talk to me and share some of the work you're doing.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Xavier.
Of course.
Yeah.